If you observed that specific hearing live, you likely missed it, just as the majority did, simply because it lacked the tone of an admission and instead mirrored standard cooperation, which was entirely intentional. Promptly at 2:47 p.m. Eastern, within the walls of the Senate Intelligence Committee, fully televised by C-SPAN and flanked by journalists accustomed to countless identical responses, Kash Patel faced a direct binary inquiry from Senator Ron Wyden. It was a query so exact that it eliminated any opportunity for translation, any space for vagueness, and any chance to steer the narrative, yet the response provided was neither affirmative nor negative. He spoke 41 words, articulated with a cadence so calculated, so methodical, and so recognizable to anyone accustomed to national security personnel, that the statement drifted through the chamber practically ignored, as though nothing significant had occurred. Ultimately, that is precisely the reason it carries such weight. This did not represent a standard interaction, an ordinary supervisory instance, or merely an easily ignored video snippet hidden beneath endless bureaucratic jargon and courteous evasion. Instead, this served as a calculated display of how authority communicates when it actively seeks to remain obscure, and how, for a fleeting second, that specific rhetoric shattered beneath the scrutiny of an individual who understood perfectly how to decipher it. The inquiry presented by Ron Wyden was surprisingly straightforward, almost feeling jarring in such an environment. He asked if the official could pledge right then to cease purchasing the geographic tracking data of American citizens. He offered no conditions, no statutory context, and no linguistic loopholes, providing only a clear boundary separating federal operational habits from foundational constitutional rights, yet Kash Patel refused to step over that boundary, choosing instead to navigate around it. He stated, using these precise terms, that the Federal Bureau utilizes every available resource to accomplish its objectives, affirming that they acquire commercially accessible data in accordance with constitutional principles and the statutes outlined by the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which has yielded crucial insights for their use alongside corporate and allied entities. Those 41 words contained zero affirmations, zero denials, and zero references to geographic tracking, meaning a passive listener treating the response like typical congressional testimony would have perceived only a routine justification of legal jurisdiction. You would hear a recognizable nod to constitutional adherence alongside a broad assertion regarding operational success, which is exactly the type of reply that projects helpfulness while admitting nothing concrete, allowing a witness to bypass the inquiry without seeming defiant. However, Ron Wyden was definitely not listening passively. Rather, he executed a maneuver that rarely ever occurs during these committee sessions by actively translating the testimony. The senator paused for 3 seconds, allowing sufficient time for the phrasing to land and for the reply to become part of the formal transcript precisely as uttered, before locking eyes with Kash Patel and stating that the Bureau intends to purchase the tracking data of citizens, noting that this appeared to be the underlying meaning cloaked in national security jargon. Instantly, the fundamental dynamic of their dialogue shifted, primarily because Wyden's tactic was not merely theatrical but rather a highly systemic, calculated, and ruthlessly accurate maneuver. He extracted a declaration engineered to survive securely inside the margins of administrative doublespeak and dragged it into clear terminology, not as an observation or a viewpoint, but as a formal translation permanently logged into the legislative transcript. It was a translation that Kash Patel, currently testifying under penalty of perjury, received a complete and instant chance to dispute, yet he declined to do so. The witness never interjected, he offered no further explanation, and he never claimed that the lawmaker had misunderstood his intentions. He allowed the translation to remain unchallenged, and within the realm of legislative hearings where all phrasing is documented, all dialogue is archived, and quietness following a blunt summarization holds immense significance, that pause outweighs whatever Patel actually conveyed in his initial remarks. Whenever a federal representative receives a targeted inquiry but replies with a broad declaration regarding statutory powers and tactical protocols, they are neither lying nor explicitly declining to speak. Instead, they are utilizing a communication style engineered to remain totally justifiable while simultaneously obscuring the maximum amount of information from any listener unfamiliar with the specialized vocabulary in play. Furthermore, this specific method of dialogue possesses a distinct title, regardless of whether it gets vocalized publicly. It is known as national security jargon. This represents the vocabulary of credible deflection, acting as the structural foundation for managed transparency, which ultimately allows an initiative to operate visibly without ever receiving direct confirmation, a strategy that succeeds with overwhelming frequency. This approach functions efficiently because the general public lacks fluency in its nuances. Committee sessions are rarely formatted to dismantle it, and typical inquiries are fundamentally unsuited to drag these truths into the daylight. However, Ron Wyden has dedicated 20 years to analyzing this precise rhetoric, this specific style of interaction, and this exact pattern of bureaucratic conduct, meaning he relied on expertise rather than assumption when deciphering the official's response. The senator instantly identified a term carrying a highly specialized definition among federal operatives, recognizing a string of words that appears benign to average citizens while serving as a covert statutory tool behind closed doors. They call it commercially accessible data, purposefully avoiding terms like monitoring, tracking, or geographic coordinates. It is a label that completely alters the statutory context of the inquiry. By ensuring information gets gathered by corporate entities and subsequently vended publicly, federal agencies avoid conventional collection methods, opting instead to buy it as a commodity, procuring the details via corporate marketplaces rather than through overt investigative monitoring. That specific contrast, representing a meticulously engineered divide separating direct gathering from financial procurement, serves as the primary technicality driving this whole interaction. Wyden understood this reality prior to posing his inquiry. He anticipated the probable reply, recognized the vocabulary that would emerge, and crucially, possessed the knowledge to translate it so the true intent became unavoidably public. On a superficial level, the statement provided by Patel remains statutorily sound, given that it invokes constitutional parameters, mentions digital privacy statutes, highlights operational requirements, and successfully dodges any precise details. Crucially, what the response fails to accomplish is outright refuting the specific conduct, and this omission is entirely deliberate. Had the Bureau truly abstained from buying citizen tracking metrics, the easiest, most straightforward, highly efficient, and instantly illuminating reply available during that hearing would have simply been the word negative. He completely avoided saying it, which causes the underlying reasoning to solidify, because in an environment permitting total transparency, offering the chance for refusal, and featuring an inquiry demanding a polarized answer, actively withholding that direct reply represents a calculated choice rather than a neutral stance. Furthermore, when this active choice precedes a declaration outlining a data procurement method widely recognized by national security professionals as encompassing the exact metrics under discussion, the discrepancy separating spoken words from actual intentions transforms into the primary narrative. Wyden eliminated that discrepancy immediately, and through this action he converted a bureaucratic reply into an open admission. This did not happen because the official explicitly mentioned geographic tracking, which he avoided, but simply because he permitted those terms to be permanently linked to his testimony without any protest. Ultimately, that remains the crucial instance the general public overlooked. It was neither the inquiry nor the 41 words, but rather the quietness trailing the summarization. Within that quietness, the true intent anchored itself into the transcript, causing vagueness to lose its defensive power as the rhetoric morphed from a protective barrier into tangible proof. Once such a scenario unfolds, where a translation enters the formal archives without facing any pushback, it transcends being merely a viral internet snippet. It permanently becomes a verified interaction capable of being quoted, sourced, scrutinized, and leveraged across all subsequent judicial and parliamentary environments. Consequently, this situation expands far beyond the events inside that chamber, focusing instead on what the interaction symbolizes regarding an apparatus depending on semantics to control oversight. It highlights operational conduct thriving in the gray area separating lawful actions from legitimate ones, stemming from an inquiry designed to never yield a transparent reply and a response engineered to evade true comprehension. Nevertheless, we find ourselves facing a formally archived declaration, an officially recorded translation, and a documented silence, allowing one inescapable deduction to manifest directly from the void separating them. The moment this deduction starts forming, the remainder of the committee session ceases to function as a mere conversation and rapidly evolves into something resembling a prosecutorial dossier compiling itself live. This occurs because Ron Wyden did far more than simply translate terminology. He forged a logical progression that Kash Patel possessed the ability to shatter at any given second, but actively declined to disrupt. That specific refusal marks the boundary where the issue moves away from semantics and shifts heavily toward ultimate accountability. Therefore, we must decelerate this analysis, avoiding the perspective of a casual spectator in favor of a litigator's methodical approach, examining the events sequentially and thoroughly. This intensive breakdown is necessary because it represents the exact point where the disparity separating spoken statements from intended meanings grows completely undeniable. The inquiry was intentionally constricted rather than expansive or hypothetical, entirely avoiding generalized questions regarding jurisdiction. Instead, it interrogated a concrete behavior linked to distinct digital metrics concerning a defined demographic, asking if the agency would cease purchasing the geographic tracking histories of citizens. Now, evaluate that against the reply, analyzing it strictly through a structural lens rather than an emotional or partisan one. Stating that the Bureau deploys every asset to achieve its objectives completely fails to answer the inquiry, serving only to define their operational breadth. Claiming they procure corporate datasets in alignment with foundational laws and digital privacy regulations merely introduces a broad classification, crucially failing to reject the notion that this classification contains geographic tracking metrics. Asserting that this method has generated crucial insights for deployment alongside corporate and allied entities simply rationalizes the behavior by emphasizing its practical value. Those three statements serve three distinct purposes, yet not one functions as a refutation, which causes the underlying paradox to intensify. If the targeted behavior was genuinely fabricated and the Bureau was truly abstaining from buying domestic tracking metrics, then volunteering a broad class of procured information would be completely superfluous and deeply deceptive. Being deceptive while sworn to tell the truth in that environment triggers severe repercussions that every single authority figure present fully comprehends. Consequently, the reply is meticulously engineered to maintain factual accuracy within its isolated context, while simultaneously dodging the single word capable of permanently resolving the inquiry, negative. That specific denial never materializes, and Ron Wyden fully grasps the significance of its omission, having monitored this precise information classification for multiple years. He has not done this during open press conferences, but rather within secure environments where the term commercially accessible data operates as a functional reality rather than an abstract concept. This terminology serves as the standard way federal departments label transactions with digital vendors, allowing them to avoid explicitly detailing the acquired material. Geographic records, hardware signatures, and transit habits all get packaged within a phrase projecting administrative dullness while secretly operating as a massive surveillance conduit. Therefore, upon hearing that specific phrasing, Wyden is not deciphering it on the fly. He is identifying an established code utilized consistently across numerous secure meetings, various departments, and years of supervisory review. His subsequent action represents the pivotal maneuver, transforming private comprehension into public documentation by verbalizing the hidden definition clearly. He declares that the department clearly intends to purchase domestic tracking metrics, framing it as a definitive observation rather than an indictment or an inquiry. He then attaches a modifier that hones the blow, asserting his belief that this is exactly what the witness conveyed through national security jargon. This addition functions as far more than casual commentary. It stands as a blatant recognition that the deployed vocabulary was engineered to conceal, and that this concealment has now been forcefully dismantled. This precise second presents Kash Patel with a critical decision, primarily because the functional regulations governing that chamber are unmistakably established in reality, not just conceptually. Whenever a legislator inaccurately summarizes your evidence, you are expected to rectify it. If a declaration gets falsely assigned to you, you must vocalize the error, and if a translation artificially broadens your reply, you are required to restrict it. Patel absolutely refuses to execute any of these protocols. He completely abstains from interjecting to explicitly deny referencing geographic tracking. He refuses to define the boundaries of corporate data procurement. And rather than restructuring his reply, he simply remains seated and allows the translation to endure. At this juncture, the situation transitions from mere evaluation into severe repercussions, because within parliamentary hearings, remaining quiet is never void of meaning. Silence is highly contextual, constantly weighed against the available chances to speak, meaning that when a representative receives a blatant opportunity to amend the transcript but refuses, that very omission fundamentally integrates into the official record, viewed strictly as an admission rather than impartiality. This reality is based entirely on institutional protocols rather than guesswork. Once this passive admission cements itself, the dialogue immediately stops debating whether the Bureau buys domestic tracking metrics, pivoting entirely toward analyzing the rationalization of the conduct and testing if that defense can withstand intense examination. Enter the counter-argument as Senator Tom Cotton interjects right after Wyden finalizes his translation, completely bypassing any refutation of the behavior in favor of providing a rationalization. The specific method he utilizes to construct this defense remains vital for comprehending the underlying judicial conflict anchoring this whole interaction. He equates the procurement of corporate geographic metrics to abandoned garbage sitting on a sidewalk, asserting that if the general public maintains access, then federal entities deserve equal access. He reasons that exposure to open markets inherently strips away any presumption of confidentiality, concluding that if the material assists police in apprehending severe threats, its utilization is completely warranted. Initially, this reasoning appears highly logical and firmly rooted in basic rationality. After all, if specific details are already circulating openly, it seems absurd to prohibit federal authorities from leveraging them. However, that initial logic disintegrates entirely upon rigorous scrutiny, failing not due to philosophical differences or partisan bickering, but directly as a result of established judicial precedents. During 2018, the highest federal tribunal ruled on Carpenter versus United States, a lawsuit squarely tackling whether state authorities could legally extract geographic metrics from external vendors without securing judicial authorization. The judicial branch delivered a reasonably transparent verdict, not entirely absolute, yet decisive enough to completely redraw the parameters of the Fourth Amendment within our modernized technological era. Tracking metrics remain inherently unique, distinct not due to the entity storing them, but specifically because of the profound intimacies they uncover. An isolated metric might appear benign, a mere chronological marker, a grid location, or a brief digital connection, yet across extended durations, these fragments construct a comprehensive chart outlining an individual's entire existence. This chart exposes their transit routines, personal connections, and intimate decisions, rendering them entirely visible through massive behavioral trends that absolutely no citizen would willingly authorize for public consumption. The locations of your residence, your employment, your religious gatherings, and your healthcare facilities, along with your personal contacts and your visitation frequencies, do not represent discarded garbage. They form an incredibly intimate psychological profile. The High Court fully acknowledged this vital difference, discarding the notion that external vendor doctrines apply seamlessly to these specific metrics. They determined that the sheer magnitude and deeply personal nature of geographic monitoring completely alters the judicial framework, pivoting the core inquiry away from whether the details were distributed and toward what those details actually expose. Once this analytical pivot occurs, the assumption of confidentiality refuses to vanish purely due to corporate involvement, returning us directly to the current situation. The material Kash Patel categorized as commercially accessible data operates exactly inside the friction, separating antiquated legal frameworks from a modern environment where metrics get stockpiled, scrutinized, and weaponized through methods entirely unimaginable when those initial judicial rules were drafted. This triggers a renewed tightening of the underlying reasoning. If federal entities are forbidden from extracting geographic metrics directly from a telecommunications provider sans judicial approval under the Carpenter ruling, yet remain capable of procuring virtually identical metrics through financial transactions with corporate vendors, the primary concern shifts dramatically. The core issue ceases to be data accessibility and becomes whether this specific acquisition tactic serves solely to circumvent foundational constitutional mandates entirely. Wyden specifically described this warrantless maneuver as an egregious circumvention of the Fourth Amendment, delivering 14 incredibly lucid, straightforward, and unmistakable words. At this point, the juxtaposition reaches total completion. Standing on one side rests a 41-word reply engineered to dodge precision while maintaining statutory safety, while the opposing side features a 14-word declaration that obliterates the bureaucratic rhetoric to explicitly identify the true consequences. This conflict transcends mere attitude, focusing purely on absolute transparency. The moment this level of transparency enters the official archives, all subsequent commentary must be evaluated against it. Every single rationalization, comparative metaphor, and defensive argument is forced to address the fundamental inquiry now dominating the interaction. The debate is no longer about information availability, practical utility, or operational success, but rather if state authorities are executing indirectly exactly what they are forbidden from achieving directly. This ceases to be a mere administrative puzzle and elevates into a profound constitutional dilemma. By framing the situation through this specific lens, discarding the specialized vocabulary, and boiling the interaction down to its absolute essence, the overarching debate completely abandons the topic of operational assets and fiercely pivots toward the concept of authoritative limits. Ultimately, the true concept being challenged within that chamber is not the Bureau's capability to procure metrics. Instead, it tests whether federal powers can fundamentally rewrite the definition of procurement itself solely to dodge the very restrictions originally implemented to keep them in check. If direct extraction mandates judicial approval while financial procurement remains unregulated, the disparity separating those verbs literally represents the boundary between upholding constitutional rights and intentionally circumventing them. This distinction is far from conceptual. It remains entirely practical, directly dictating the level of surveillance millions of oblivious citizens endure daily. This specific juncture prompts Ron Wyden to redirect the dialogue once more, pulling it from theoretical realms directly into tangible repercussions. He transcends debating mere semantics, fiercely contesting the massive capabilities that such deceptive terminology successfully facilitates on a national level. He essentially questions the outcome of injecting a theoretical statutory technicality into a digital architecture capable of analyzing data at magnitudes that 20th century judicial bodies never remotely imagined. This reality stretches far beyond a solitary device, a single target, or an isolated inquiry. It involves massive digital clusters encompassing millions of hardware units and endless geographic coordinates, all gathered without documented suspicion, judicial authorizations, or personalized probable cause. Instead, they are secured via financial exchanges and wholesale procurements that transform intimate civilian transit into commercial merchandise. The moment this merchandise materializes and resides within a federal network, the subsequent phase shifts from mere storage directly into intensive scrutiny. This marks a massive narrative pivot, demonstrating that the most perilous aspect of this interaction is not the verified data procurement, but rather the terrifying implications regarding the activities occurring immediately following the transaction. Wyden clarifies this threat perfectly by bringing algorithmic machine learning into the discussion. He refuses to frame it as some futuristic concept, actively identifying it as an active technological asset that fundamentally exponentially magnifies the sheer volume of the surveillance apparatus in question. By possessing the geographic histories of countless individuals, authorities completely eliminate the need to isolate specific targets. They bypass the necessity for identities or judicial approvals entirely, simply executing a digital search command to reveal every cellular device located at a specific coordinate, identify hardware frequenting a particular building repeatedly, or track electronics moving between distinct zones during an exact chronological window instantaneously without establishing a preliminary target. Operatives synthesize comprehensive rosters, cataloging citizens who worshipped at a designated mosque, patients who consulted a particular physician, or attendees of a specific partisan rally. These groups are compiled not due to any underlying criminal suspicion, but purely because the digital metrics allowed operatives to retroactively map their personal existences. This scenario avoids both assumption and theory, backed completely by verified proof referenced within congressional documents detailing how military intelligence bought geographic metrics from a religious application to surveil Islamic demographics. This surveillance bypassed judicial approvals and personalized suspicions entirely, relying squarely on the identical statutory workaround debated during that committee session, utilizing the exact classification of commercially accessible data outlined within those original 41 words. Consequently, by invoking machine learning, Wyden avoids projecting an unprecedented hazard, opting instead to link a current operational habit with a rapidly advancing technological weapon. He successfully demonstrates how an administrative technicality appearing relatively contained suddenly turns devastatingly potent when merged with digital architectures engineered to identify behavioral trends across colossal information clusters. At this specific point, the ethical implications grow impossible to ignore, completely dragging the debate away from strict statutory compliance and plunging it into issues of civic transparency. We must ask what it genuinely signifies to inhabit a society where your physical transits get bought, stockpiled, and scrutinized entirely without your awareness, your permission, or judicial authorization, lacking any mandate forcing state authorities to justify why your metrics were scooped up initially. We have to consider the societal impact when our baseline existence shifts from confidentiality to constant vulnerability. Even more critically, we must evaluate a reality where the singular defense preventing that vulnerability from being weaponized is a bureaucratic classification practically invisible to the public ear, commercially accessible data. Those three syllables generate zero panic, offer absolutely zero transparency, and completely fail to convey the massive scope of the operation. Nevertheless, hiding directly behind that mundane vocabulary operates an infrastructure capable of charting your existence with an exactness that the architects of the Fourth Amendment could never have fathomed. This apparatus entirely avoids physically breaching your residence, opting instead to virtually rebuild your transit history using the hardware permanently attached to your person, and it permanently skips requesting authorization simply by purchasing the desired intelligence from corporate vendors. This represents the stark dichotomy Wyden relentlessly forces into the spotlight. Occupying one extreme is a federal apparatus, insisting it functions lawfully by deploying authorized assets to secure critical insights. Occupying the opposite extreme is a foundational constitutional structure engineered to mandate rationale prior to invasion, to require supervision prior to extraction, and to guarantee that sovereign authority operates under strict boundaries, not merely as an option but as an absolute requirement. Residing directly between these two conflicting ideologies lies a massive void, an opening expansive enough to conceal an entire digital monitoring complex. This realization brings us directly to the pending statutes fundamentally tethered to this testimony, highlighting that this is not a conceptual argument echoing through a congressional chamber, but rather an active legislative battle featuring a hard expiration date that drastically elevates the importance of every spoken word. In exactly 32 days, lawmakers are slated to vote on renewing the monitoring powers authorized by Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. These specific jurisdictions have consistently faced severe backlash and rigorous examination, as they legally permit international espionage but habitually end up capturing the digital correspondence of domestic citizens in the process. Permanently linked to this impending vote is the Government Surveillance Reform Act, representing a bipartisan initiative focused on a surgical statutory repair rather than political posturing. This legislation demands that federal departments secure judicial approval prior to buying citizens' geographic metrics, internet histories, query logs, or artificial intelligence conversations from corporate vendors, deliberately aiming to seal the precise technicality laid bare during the committee session. This proposal avoids extremist ideologies and symbolic theatricality entirely, boasting co-sponsors across the political spectrum. It includes Senator Mike Lee, a right-leaning Republican who has consistently warned that monitoring jurisdictions have shattered their constitutional barriers, alongside Representative Warren Davidson, who bluntly argues that modern protocols permit federal entities to harvest intimate digital records while completely bypassing traditional legal hurdles. Therefore, Kash Patel's testimony does not occur in an isolated bubble. He is delivering these remarks a mere 24 hours after conducting closed-door sessions with legislators where he actively lobbied to renew those exact powers without implementing the judicial oversight mandate championed by Wyden. He provides testimony knowing the impending legislative decision will dictate if his outlined procedures survive unaltered or face massive restrictions. This underlying environment is critical because it confirms those 41 words transcended mere description. They functioned as a calculated tactic within a larger campaign to brand the behavior as legal, vital, and successful, aggressively pushing the narrative that current jurisdictions remain adequate, extra limitations are superfluous, and the existing digital apparatus must survive unmodified. Consequently, Wyden's rebuttal operated with equal tactical brilliance, avoiding increased volume or aggressive posturing in favor of surgical accuracy. The senator completely bypassed broad arguments and theoretical tangents. Instead, he seized the official's reply, deciphered it, logged it into the transcript, and instantly connected it to the looming congressional verdict. This brilliant maneuver made it entirely impossible to untangle the written statutes from the actual operational conduct, permanently linking the impending ballot to the tangible reality it seeks to regulate. Wyden successfully frames the interaction as Exhibit A, elevating it from a simple illustration directly into hard evidence. The moment a statement transitions into evidence, its entire functional nature shifts, evolving from a casual dialogue into a foundational element of a legal argument, serving as a citable referential anchor used to explicitly demand that distinct bureaucratic behaviors receive targeted legislative consequences. This effectively guarantees that the upcoming chapter of this narrative will not occur within the committee chamber, but rather during the impending legislative vote. Moving forward, any politician casting a ballot regarding this statute acts with this precise testimony fully archived, the senator's translation entirely undisputed, and the underlying digital surveillance completely verified, officially documented, and universally comprehended rather than merely assumed. This completely shifts the burden of accountability, primarily because supporting a statute while shrouded in ambiguity is fundamentally different from endorsing it after unquestionable transparency has been dragged into the public square. Here, the intense scrutiny migrates away from the testifying official and lands squarely on the legislative floor, transitioning away from national security jargon into binding statutory rhetoric. What began as a fleeting interaction ignored by the masses evolves into a monumental verdict that absolutely zero participants will manage to sidestep. Consequently, the event ceases to function as a simple supervisory meeting and transforms into a profound trial. It tests not an isolated representative or a solitary department, but rather the entire bureaucratic apparatus, questioning if the structure responsible for this interaction possesses the capacity for self-correction after being so thoroughly exposed in the daylight. The reality remains that every vital component has already transpired. The inquiry was launched, the reply was provided, the summarization was officially archived, and the subsequent quietness permanently cemented the true intent. Therefore, the solitary remaining element involves the impending aftermath, and this upcoming phase abandons mere rhetoric in favor of definitive legislative action. The undeniable truth anchoring this entire situation, once stripped of its deceptive phrasing, carefully constructed framing, and every single layer of vocabulary designed to cushion the blow, is terrifyingly simple. Federal authorities are fully capable of purchasing your geographic metrics, not due to criminal suspicion or judicial authorization, but simply because a corporate entity harvested the details, bundled them together, and listed them on the open market. This signifies that the legal safeguards you believed were guaranteed are no longer solely dependent on constitutional rights. Instead, your privacy is entirely tethered to a digital economy, completely reliant on whether your metrics have been successfully commodified by a corporate enterprise deciding that your physical transits represent a highly profitable retail item. The instant this commercialization occurs, the protective boundary originally designed to mandate judicial reasoning prior to a privacy invasion morphs into something profoundly different, a simple financial exchange. Here, the ethical juxtaposition intensifies into an undeniable crisis. Occupying one half of this paradigm is an apparatus explicitly engineered for maximum operational efficiency, actively harvesting intelligence to neutralize dangers by deploying every accessible asset to accomplish its goals. Occupying the opposing half are average citizens entirely divorced from any active inquiry and completely free of criminal accusations, whose daily existences are systematically charted, archived, and scrutinized without their awareness or permission. They lack the fundamental safeguards that have historically separated sovereign power from civilian life, such as judicial review, probable cause, and legitimate reasoning, which function as tangible legal shields rather than mere philosophical ideas. Whenever these critical defenses are actively bypassed, not shattered through overt violations but quietly circumvented via frameworks permitting identical results through alternative avenues, the tangible damage to the public remains exactly the same, regardless of how drastically the descriptive terminology changes. Ultimately, whether state authorities directly extract your geographic metrics or procure them financially through a corporate vendor, the final consequence is completely identical. They possess the intelligence, they maintain the capability to weaponize it, and they absolutely never requested your authorization. Therefore, the central inquiry becomes completely inescapable, transcending political bickering and partisan rhetoric to serve as a foundational stress test regarding the proper operation of a constitutional republic. We must determine if the specific avenue of extraction truly outweighs the final consequence of the surveillance itself. Is it genuinely relevant that digital intelligence was bought rather than legally confiscated? Assuming the ultimate reality remains identical, a massive invasion into an individual's most intimate affairs? Furthermore, does it signify anything that the vocabulary utilized to outline the behavior deliberately dodges precise definitions, provided those exact definitions are easily rebuilt through situational context and verified by an opponent's refusal to speak? If society ultimately answers these inquiries affirmatively, then the bureaucratic reasoning deployed during that committee session remains entirely valid and legally sound. However, if the response is negative, meaning the final consequence defines the severity of the invasion and the tangible impact on the citizen dictates if a boundary was violated, then the events inside that chamber represent a severe constitutional breach rather than a minor technicality. It is certainly not a theatrical violation heralded by furious declarations or public outrage, but rather a silent transgression deeply woven into an administrative apparatus perfectly trained to navigate the absolute limits of its own legal restrictions. This distinction is exactly what makes the situation incredibly unique. The reality did not surface via unauthorized whistleblowers. It evaded discovery by aggressive journalistic inquiries, and it absolutely was not unveiled by an operative actively violating institutional protocols. On the contrary, it was openly declared during a sworn televised hearing before being flawlessly translated into standard vocabulary, while the initial speakers simply remained seated, fully permitting that summarization to permanently define his remarks. This interaction does not represent a collapse of classified security protocols. Instead, it signifies a massive failure in bureaucratic containment. Once that internal containment collapses, the burden of responsibility forcibly migrates. It transfers directly to the newly informed public, to the politicians preparing to cast their ballots, and to the overarching governmental structure, which must urgently decide whether to eradicate the newly exposed technicality or abandon it to be formally legitimized into permanent legislation. The impending congressional ballot symbolizes exactly this dilemma. It acts not as a theoretical expansion of monitoring jurisdiction or a standard reauthorization of current abilities, but as a definitive choice regarding whether to mandate judicial oversight prior to buying civilian metrics or to authorize the continued unregulated financial procurement of that exact intelligence. It remains a stark ultimatum separating the synchronization of operational conduct with foundational values from the deliberate rewriting of those values to excuse the conduct. Furthermore, this pivotal decision is currently guided by an official transcript that fundamentally did not exist in such a concrete manner merely 24 hours prior to the interaction. Prior to this exact instance, the financial acquisition of geographic metrics survived within a realm of credible deniability. It was conceded in pieces, debated within classified documents, and comprehended by individuals holding security clearances, yet it remained unverified in any format capable of being isolated within a committee archive and recited without requiring further translation. Presently, it absolutely can be cited, and the successful documentation of this reality drastically alters the legislative baseline. Once a procedure achieves verification and ceases to be theoretical, the primary challenge is no longer demonstrating its existence, but rather fiercely debating if its continuation is acceptable. This transition marks the point where the narrative transcends the individuals involved, abandoning the dynamic between Ron Wyden and Kash Patel to focus on whether our judicial framework remains actively responsive to objective reality or merely reacts to it defensively. We must ascertain whether the law establishes the parameters dictating permissible operations, or if it simply stretches those borders retroactively to accommodate overreach that has already transpired. If statutory regulations merely trail behind operational habits, morphing to justify active procedures instead of limiting potential actions, then the demand for true accountability falls completely subordinate to the request for retroactive authorization. Securing authorization strictly after an invasion is fundamentally unequal to mandating approval prior to the operation. This exact contrast resides at the absolute core of the Fourth Amendment, and it represents the specific boundary currently facing intense systemic stress. Therefore, upon revisiting that specific instance, re-examining those initial 41 words, and processing the Senator's subsequent summarization, you must actively recognize the lack of refutation. When you observe the total absence of denial and the absolute failure to restrict the newly exposed reality, you must deeply comprehend the true nature of the events unfolding on screen. You are definitely not witnessing a simple miscommunication or an accidental verbal error. Instead, you are observing an administrative apparatus communicating comfortably in its native jargon before being violently compelled for a fleeting second to communicate in a vocabulary the public can understand. The instant this summarization materializes, forcing both variations to reside adjacently within identical legislative archives, the void separating the two ceases to be an issue of subjective translation and immediately transforms into a matter of intentional decision-making. Consequently, we arrive at the lingering inquiry, the singular question immune to bureaucratic phrasing, which acts as the foundation for every counterargument, rationalization, and defensive posture provided since the video fragment initially gained traction. If federal entities are capable of securing identical levels of intimate visibility into your daily existence entirely without judicial approval by merely buying your digital footprint, what precise threats is the Fourth Amendment actually shielding you against? Should the answer reveal diminished protections, suggesting our security relies entirely on easily manipulated corporate marketplaces rather than steadfast constitutional values, allowing for massive digital extractions without activating traditional defensive protocols? How can we legitimately argue that those safeguards survive in any functional capacity? This is far from a hypothetical inquiry. It represents the literal verdict currently sitting directly before the legislative branch. 32 days remains the exact timeline, representing the critical opening where this interaction will morph into either a monumental paradigm shift or a forgotten historical footnote. It will ultimately signify the precise juncture where a massive statutory vulnerability was finally eradicated, or the exact moment it was silently embraced as a permanent fixture of our governing apparatus. Therefore, if you reach the conclusion of this analysis, absorb the committee interaction, and fully comprehended both the spoken vocabulary and the deliberate omissions, recognizing the translated intent alongside the unchallenged silence. This marks the crucial transition where mere observation must evolve. Simple comprehension devoid of tangible pushback alters absolutely nothing. Hit the like button if you believe these extractions mandate a judge's signature, and drop a comment arguing whether Kash Patel understood the gravity of his admission or if Ron Wyden forcefully dragged the reality into the light. Distribute this essay to ensure a broader audience grasps the true meaning behind those 41 syllables. And make sure to subscribe, because once those 32 days evaporate and the congressional ballot opens, we will witness exactly how the federal machinery responds to the inquiry launched inside that chamber.